27 minutes past 1. A very good afternoon and a warm welcome to our S3 viewers. We're coming to you live from the Nasrec Expo Centre this afternoon, where South Africa's historic G20 presidency will this weekend culminate into the G20 Leaders Summit at this very location. My name is Mfundo Mabalani and I'm not alone. Joining me in studio today for more on the G20 Summit is SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Good afternoon, Sherwin.
Good afternoon, Mfundo.
It's a pleasure to have you with us yet again. Sherwin, quite a lot there being stated by the president, but perhaps to start with the biggest talking point, a scourge that for many has become something that has preoccupied the minds of South Africans. He has today stated or announced that government is willing or looking to recognize GBV as a crisis, and they will then move forward in ensuring there is concerted effort to end the scourge. What do you make of just that recognition today, specifically on the eve of that protest that was to be had tomorrow?
I think it speaks to one of the pressing issues that South Africa, in particular, in a broader developmental context, is dealing with. You will recall, Mfundo, that gender equity and empowerment is goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals. South Africa, in addition to having to address issues like other member states around the world, right, that endorse the Sustainable Development Goals, has a particular imposition in terms of GBV. And you have seen this president from time to time seek to amplify the work that is being done, but as you and I both know, the mitigation efforts that have been in place are simply not addressing what is a global scourge, but one that faces South Africa in particular. And what you saw after the COVID-19 pandemic in particular was an elevation, an increase, impugning the goal, the trajectory that we had been on. And so we are faced now with a global problem that can not only be addressed by what the government says it will do, by making pronouncements. This is, you know, you're speaking at the social summit, and what that speaks to is the need for an all hands on deck approach, an all of society approach, not just to deal with gender equity, but to deal with the broader development agenda that South Africa has infused into this G20 summit, seeking to invigorate the Sustainable Development 2030 global agenda. And if you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I'll give you the first 5: no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, the list goes on. Doesn't that remind you of something? Ah, yes, equality, sustainability, so solidarity. What's that? The theme of the G20 summit. And what there has been, what the South Africans have recognized. The president just said now at the social summit, let me quote him here, it is going to give practical meaning to what global solidarity is all about. We will set a new course for the world. And what that new course looks like is closing the financing gap, the $4.3 trillion gap that is missing in terms of SDG implementation. And what you find in terms of that is the empowerment and equity of women that is sacrosanct, that is so vital to achieving all the other goals.
I want us to talk a bit more around the SDGs, specifically the elevation of the role of the United Nations here when we speak of the G20, because there was that deliberate incorporation of the 2030 agenda, but also the SDGs, because as you state, at the heart of it, it really has become that developmental agenda where beyond it being an economic forum for cooperation here, it has essentially become developmental. And when we look at South Africa is the last of the South to host such a summit, the first, of course, on the continent. But many would say that that gives us the benefit of refining this developmental agenda where our priorities are then crystallized. And we've seen this with some of those priorities, specifically the one about harnessing critical minerals. Very important. It speaks to beneficiation. And we know that South Africa is saying that we need to ensure that all the mineral-rich nations are actually equitably benefiting. And what does that translate to when you have this conversation here at the Leaders Summit, at the G20? How does that look like?
There is an ideological battle, I think, that is fomenting within the G20. You talk about the last 4 presidency, right, from the global south: Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and the developmental focus that we have now seen, in terms of the agenda being infused and how that aligns with what is essentially the core mandate of the United Nations, which is the development focus, which includes things like climate change. And then you have the elephant in the room, but not in the room this weekend, which is the United States. And what the United States has already said is they've criticized the expansive nature of the G20 away from what was its core mandate, which was essentially to manage and create stability in terms of market stability, global market stability, macroeconomic policy, to stabilize a global economy. Because where did the G20 get its chops, right? It was after the Asian crisis, economic crisis in the late 1990s, and of course the economic implosion that we saw in 2007. And what the South Africans have done here, as they've built on the Brazilians and the Indians and the Indonesians before that, with the United Nations in the realm, is to say we cannot just be focused on market stability when you have intractable issues like poverty, food insecurity, climate justice, right? We cannot just focus on core issues. We have to now broaden the mandate, and what the US is saying, we want to return to that mandate. So the question then becomes, given the trajectory of the Global South presidencies, what does the United States do? Does it take the agenda forward? Does it put the brakes on? Do we circumnavigate the year that is ahead of us in terms of the US presidency? And does the United Kingdom, as part of that troika that essentially is the core of the G20 moving forward, does the UK then pick up where South Africa left off, as you avoid the iceberg that is the US in this context?
Now, if US wanted to narrow the scope of the G20, then it takes us back yet again to saying that the global financial architecture is on the microscope. And we saw with the Africa Expert Panel report that was handed over that among the reforms is of the IMF. It's still a sticking point. Also, among the reforms, or at least some of their suggestions, is that we need regulation, strengthening of regulation around the rating agencies, because they say that there is a distorted perspective around South Africa or Africa insofar as its risk profile. That is a very contentious conversation, because if you look at the ratings agencies, one would say you've got America with a GDP to debt ratio that's sitting at 125%, showing we are at 75.1% as South Africa. And if the rating agencies will retain or place a USA at an investment grade, some would challenge that and say, really, we need greater strengthening of these ratings agencies. But one would say that also presupposes that you're saying the only metric there is just your GDP to debt ratio, when it isn't. It's political stability. It's your ability to generate revenue, which America does. So one wonders that when they have that very difficult conversation, because it's noble, it honestly is, when you say, let us look at these rating agencies. But if you look at it, it seems the criteria goes beyond GDP to debt ratio.
What I don't want to do is sit here and defend the ratings agencies, but I think the message is seeping through. You saw S&P upgrade South Africa's sovereign debt ratio rating. You've also seen the United States being downgraded by the ratings agencies of late. And so there certainly seems to be some recalibration that is underway, but this speaks to a broader problem. When you talk about reforming the global financial architecture, the people that are most responsible for the reform are the ones that have the largest voting rights on the boards that govern the IMF, that govern the World Bank. And who are they? Who are they? They are the same people that control the Security Council and various other financial institutions.
So it's essentially our P5.
Right, and so there's a rejigging that needs to happen, but there is resistance to that trajectory. And so the question then, in terms of what Ronald Lamola, the Minister of International Relations, said earlier this week, in terms of how do we circumnavigate, how do we ensure that the world can move ahead without the opposition, perhaps, of a country like the United States, right? You want them included, but if they're going to be in opposition to what broad consensus is seeking to achieve, how do we then navigate those choppy waters and exclude the United States while we continue to move ahead? And that is the complication in terms of the financial architecture, right? You have new development banks, the BRICS Development Bank. What is the capacity of those banks? To what extent can they be? Can that capacity be enlarged? And how does that then engender the implementation that has been lacking on the development agenda? We talk about outcome documents and declarations and all the like. Means nothing if at the end of the day we're just here to talk and slap each other on the back and sing hurrah, we got there, well done South Africa, first African G20, but then it has to be translated into changes on the ground. What does climate justice look like for people in Iduchwa? What is poverty and alleviation and food insecurity, and creating the systems that can sustain the needs of the African continent? How do we ensure their beneficiation in terms of this critical mineral future that is absolutely critical to things like Artificial intelligence, what does that mean? Data centers, communications technologies, robotics, how we, electric cars, moving away from the fossil fuel glut to a renewable future. That's going to be important, but how do we ensure that beneficiation, which means how do we create supply chains around the industry here? We don't just export raw materials, but we create legacy for communities where these minerals are being extracted, and the add-on and ripple effect that can create in terms of addressing things like stubborn unemployment and poverty and food insecurity. I mean, it's all related.
And it's not a novel concept, Sherwin, honestly speaking, that when we speak of beneficiation, it's been a conversation across many fora. So it's honestly going to have to come down to implementation at this point, because it is nothing new. We know exactly where we need to play. We need to play in the tertiary space, not this primary space of just raw extraction of minerals. But we'll leave it there for now, Sherwin. We'll certainly pick up our conversation, because there's certainly a lot to talk about when it comes to South Africa's priorities on its historic G20 presidency.